Resistance in psychotherapy can have many different manifestations, but one that is almost most frequent and most frequently discussed is what is called acting out. The term acting out originates again with Freud, who mentioned it in one of his least successful psychotherapy treatments in the case of Dora, and then wrote one of his most famous papers at around the beginning of the World War I, where he discusses this in great detail. The paper is titled Remembering, Repeating and Working Through, and it lays the foundation for so many psychoanalytic ideas related to theory and practice to the same extent. Freud's basic idea is that thinking, connecting, being able to understand the causes and consequences and the connection between them is what brings mental health and cure and the development of the mind. He believed, since he heard about the case of Anna O for the first time, that the dissociation between the cause and consequence, the incapacity to understand what triggered something and where that led, is the cause of mental disorders. So Freud writes in this paper that the problem of his patients, the problem of the neurotics, is that they cannot remember, that they cannot think about something, so they have to repeat it in behavior. And this led to important theoretical and clinical insights and to at least a slight exaggeration, I think. On the one hand, yes, indeed, in clinical practice we can see that. When we are not capable of facing something, of allowing ourselves an insight, when we cannot accept the confrontation coming from a psychotherapist or some other person, we tend to repeat patterns of behavior that are not good for us. On the other hand, the exaggeration is that psychoanalysts of the coming decades will prefer thinking to behavior always and everywhere. Like humans should be some ideal mentalizers, some super self-reflective beings that will never make mistakes, that will never enjoy, that will never switch off their brains and be just in life. Anyway, acting out became almost a synonym for resistance, and meant initially that when something happens in sessions, when something happens in the relationship between the patient and the therapist, or the patient is near to the moment when he or she will have to accept something that they don't like to accept about themselves, or parents, or children, or spouses, whatever, they will do something outside of the psychoanalytic setting, before or after the sessions with other people, that will make further progress of the therapy at that moment impossible. They will not openly tell the analyst, for instance, I don't like what you're telling me, but they will start major fights with the boss at work, with the spouse at home, and so on. This will completely occupy their minds, and then what was near to be figured out, to be understood and accepted, will remain in the past. When I'm not capable of saying no to my analyst, I might say no and completely change my life circumstances at that moment. Or when I want my analyst to admire me for instance, saying no, I will do it outside of the context and then come back and tell the stories about what is going on there. And in the analytic room, in the analytic work, the pressure will fall down, the urgency will fall down, and we will have to wait for another opportunity to understand these things, which might come in a couple of months or even longer. Acting out later on became distinguished from what was called acting in. So acting in starting late 1950s, is the same as acting out, just happening in the office, in the setting, in the psychoanalytic session. I have such a strong resistance that I wouldn't like to understand something about myself, but I don't go out to get drunk or all of a sudden have to travel overnight and have to skip the next 4 sessions or something like that. But I do something in the session. I start focusing on something that can lead to, hopefully, to a conflict that may make my analyst incapable of thinking, listening, understanding. There are papers about humor being used as a tool for acting in. I make my analyst laugh so he or she cannot think about my painful past and such stuff. Until this time, late 1950s, 60s, and later on, every time acting is mentioned, it has a negative connotation. Interaction, action, acting in, acting out, and so on, none of that is considered to be positive. It is, as far as I know, the work of Edgar Levinson, a very renowned interpersonal psychoanalyst in the US, that introduces the idea of enactment as something that is unavoidable. So enactment is when both analyst and the patient are involved in some sort of behavior rather than thinking, or behavior before the thinking. Levinson and many interpersonalists will believe that we cannot even think before something has happened, and now we can try to reflect on it. This involves many different situations for which textbooks can never prepare us, that are unpredictable, idiosyncratic, happen to these two persons at this moment. One example described by Professor Brett Carr in one paper in American Imago is about the analyst who wanted to finish the session, part with the patient, and open the door. And then all of a sudden the doorknob remained in his hand, and the patient could not leave, and the next patient could not enter before the locksmith came to liberate them, so to say, from the room. So what do you do at this moment? It's a completely unpredictable situation. No supervisor has prepared you for that. How do you react to this? And then all possible human imperfections. You forget the name of someone's husband. You forget how many years ago exactly something happened, and so on. And this becomes, hopefully, the basis for further reflection of what is the unconscious trying to tell you about this. The additional meaning of enactment is that the analyst could be unconsciously becoming a part of the script in the patient's life, in the repetition of patient's painful previous experience, in a way similar to what in London would be described as projective identification. The analyst is not aware why, but he or she is doing something unusual in the session, taking an attitude, behaving differently, talking differently, and it turns out that this is very similar to the patient's traumatic experience from the past, and in a way probably triggered by something patient did or said. So there are different meanings to this concept. As psychoanalysts, we try most of the time to take all of these behavioral expressions into thinking, into self-reflection, as soon as possible, as thoroughly as possible, especially at moments when patients might be doing something that is dangerous. And this is all the basis, I'm not sure how conscious or unconscious, for one of the most famous books in the history of psychotherapy, and that is Love's Executioner by Irvin Yalom, where the first story is exactly about this, that he does not like to analyze people who are acutely in love, because then the acting outs that are natural to these situations are opposite to psychotherapy, and whatever a psychotherapist does, the patient loses. So this was a brief series of videos about resistance in psychotherapy. It may continue one day, we don't know that at this moment, but these were some of the most important forms of resistance and a little bit of tips about what psychoanalysts do about it.